The sound of boots crunching on dry hay wasn't what woke me. It was the snap of a heavy padlock in Grandpa's voice, drifting through the open window, as he said, "Well, if they want to inspect, let them inspect. Just not the outside world for a while." I sat up in bed, blinking away the sleep, just in time to see him toss a chain over his shoulder, whistle low, and walk off with a fishing rod, like he hadn't just locked two grown men inside our barn. It started an hour earlier, when a dusty white SUV with HOA patrol stenciled on its side came crawling down the gravel road, like it was scared to wake the land itself. I was on the porch, tying up my boots, when the vehicle stopped right in front of the barn, without so much as a greeting. Two guys stepped out, matching polo shirts, matching clipboards, and matching smug looks, like they were born in an HOA factory. One had a radio on his shoulder, and the other wore aviators, like he thought he was in a movie. They didn't knock, didn't wave, just walked right up to the barn and started pushing the doors open, like they were flipping through someone's mail. Grandpa didn't yell. He didn't storm. He just stood there, watching them from the porch, like a man watching squirrels climb into a trap. "New ones?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Same old, different starch. We weren't even part of the HOA. That was the most ridiculous part. Our land had been exempt since before most of those cookie-cutter homes were built across the road. But ever since a new board took over, they'd been trying to expand their so-called zone of enforcement. They'd come by a few times already. First with flyers, then with vague threats, and finally with clips and notices printed in fonts so small it needed a microscope to read. That morning, though, they didn't come to talk. They came to snoop. I stepped off the porch just in time to see one of them take out his phone and start recording inside the barn. The other began scribbling something down, probably noting the stacked hay bales, the feed sacks, the tractors, or the fact that we hadn't painted the side of the barn in a while. Grandpa muttered something under his breath, walked to the tool shed, and came out with a length of chain so thick it looked like it belonged to a battleship. Then, calm as a breeze, he walked up to the barn doors, looped the chain through the handles, and snapped the padlock shut. The guy with the radio came rushing toward the doors, banging on them like a kid who just realized he was on the wrong ride. "You can't lock us in here," he yelled, voice muffled by the thick wood and insulted ego. Grandpa just smiled, tipped his straw hat up, and said, "Didn't say I was locking you in. I'm just keeping the barn shut." Then he turned to me, handed me the spare key, and said, "If the sheriff calls, tell him I am at the lake," before walking toward his truck with a fishing rod in hand and a lunch cooler under his arm. I didn't move for a moment. Neither did the HOA patrol's third guy, who'd stayed in the SUV and was now blinking like he just watched his coworkers disappear into Narnia. I walked back up to the porch and sat down slowly, watching the chain sway slightly in the breeze, while angry, muffled voices started to rise from inside. "You're going to regret this," came a voice. "This is a crime. You broke into a private structure," I muttered, sipping coffee from Grandpa's second favorite mug, which said, "I'd agree with you, but then we'd both be wrong." 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Caller ID, Sheriff Randall. I picked up and said hello as casually as I could. "Why am I getting calls from some guy claiming he's being held hostage in your barn?" The sheriff asked, not angry, more like half amused, half chewing something. "Because he is in my barn," I replied. "Did he have a warrant?" "Nope." "Did he ask permission?" "Nope." "Did he record anything?" "Yep." There was a pause. Then the sheriff said, "Let him sweat. I'll swing by later if I feel generous." "What's your grandpa doing?" "Fishing." He laughed. "Sounds about right." I looked over at the third HOA guy, who had now exited the vehicle and was pacing outside the barn, like he was trying to calculate how much trouble his coworkers were in versus how much blame he could reasonably shift. He pulled out a phone and started dialing. Probably the director, maybe a lawyer, maybe his mom. Then the yelling inside the barn got louder. Not angry now, panicked. Turns out Grandpa had been experimenting with beekeeping again. Not commercial, not illegal, just a couple of hives in the back of the barn, kept sealed and quiet. But those bees were sensitive to movement. And with two loud strangers stomping around and waving clipboards like fly swatters, the bees had stirred. "You brought insects into the building," one of the men shouted, voice crackling through the walls. "This is a health code violation. You trespassed into a livestock barn," I muttered under my breath. "This ain't a salad bar." The third guy backed away slowly, like he just realized things were going from HOA drama to viral headline. I sat there, listening to the panic and pacing, and felt a strange sort of peace. Not the kind that comes from revenge, just the satisfaction of watching arrogant people trap themselves with their own assumptions. Grandpa hadn't shouted. He hadn't fought. He just let the barn, the bees, and the Lord take their course. And the best part? He didn't even miss a single fish. The sun was just beginning to shift toward noon when the second HOA vehicle rolled up in a huff of gravel and overconfidence. This one was newer, shinier, with a magnetic decal that read HOA Enforcement Director, slapped on the side, like a sheriff's badge made out of printer ink and misplaced authority. A woman stepped out. Pantsuit, clipboard already in hand, and the kind of walk that said she'd never been told no without emailing 3 follow-ups. She didn't glance around, didn't say hello, didn't even blink at the barn that was still shaking faintly with the muffled panic of its occupants. Instead, she marched right up to the porch, like she was about to deliver a TED talk on the importance of obedience. "I'm Director Kane," she said, tone clipped and nasal, like she was chewing air instead of words. "We've received a report that 2 of our field officers are being unlawfully detained on this property." I didn't stand. I just looked over the rim of my coffee mug and said, "Did they mention they trespassed first?" "That's irrelevant," she snapped, waving a laminated paper that looked like it had been printed 5 minutes ago. "This area falls under newly approved HOA boundaries as of last quarter. Your structures, livestock, and outbuildings are now subject to inspection." I took the paper slowly and stared at the grid of blurry lines and watermark stamps. It looked official, at least in the way of forgery. Looks convincing when you squint. "This doesn't even match the county plat." I said, "Our land is exempt. Has been for decades. We've got a deed, a court ruling from '98, and an agreement signed by the zoning board." She narrowed her eyes. The kind of look people give when facts don't align with their plans. "We're enforcing compliance under emergency clause revisions. No one around here voted for those clauses. Emergency authority doesn't require consent." "Then maybe you ought to prepare for an emergency," I said and nodded toward the barn. She turned just in time to see one of the patrolmen inside slap something off a shelf while shrieking about bees again. From the porch, it sounded like he was wrestling a swarm of mosquitoes armed with razor blades. The other one had apparently given up arguing and started broadcasting again, because a faint voice echoed from somewhere. "This is harassment. We are being illegally confined in what appears to be a barn used for illicit livestock practices." I couldn't help it. I snorted. Illicit livestock practices. What were we running? A black market goat ring? Director Kane didn't laugh. Instead, she pulled out a phone, made a dramatic swipe, and announced, "I'm calling the sheriff. You will regret obstructing an official inspection." "He already called," I said. "Told me to let you stew." She didn't respond. She walked back to her SUV, jaw set like a bear trap, and began pacing with her phone to her ear, switching between HOA headquarters and someone she kept calling legal. I could hear every other word. Unacceptable. Viral potential. Civil suit. And speaking of viral, that's when the patrolman inside decided to live stream again. Whether it was desperation or arrogance, I'll never know. But he flipped his phone camera toward himself and began another rant. This time, directly into the internet. These rural criminals have trapped us inside this death trap of a barn. There are bees. We are being stung. This place smells like livestock. I repeat, we are being held hostage. He swung the phone around to capture the barn's interior, and that's where things went sideways. Because in his dramatic sweep, he managed to film himself pushing open a locked cabinet, pawing through labeled containers of raw honey, tapping on jars, and saying things like, "They are hoarding illegal, unlicensed products." The comments section lit up. Thousands of viewers started joining the stream. Some were laughing, others tagging local news, and more than a few pointed out loudly and repeatedly that recording yourself trespassing while accusing someone else of a crime wasn't exactly a legal masterstroke. But the real kicker came when someone in the comments recognized the logo on one of the jars. It wasn't just Grandpa's bees. It was part of a protected regional pollinator initiative tied to the state's agricultural grant. The logo meant those bees and their habitat were under federal conservation. Anyone disturbing them without permission, especially on private land, could be fined, penalized, or in serious cases, prosecuted. I watched director Kane freeze as her own phone started blowing up with notifications. I could see the shock ripple across her features in slow motion, eyebrows twitching, mouth slightly open, hand frozen halfway to her Bluetooth headset. She tapped frantically at her screen, scrolling through the footage that was now making its rounds across social media under the hashtag #Barngate. It wasn't long before the real cavalry arrived. A county zoning official named Morales pulled up in a dusty Ford sedan, visibly annoyed and holding a manila folder like it owed him money. "I saw the stream," he muttered as he walked toward me. "You got the deed?" I handed it to him. He skimmed it, flipped a page, and then turned to Director Kane with the blandest voice I'd ever heard. "This land isn't part of your HOA. It's not even inside your proposed annex. These actions fall way outside your authority." But they refused inspection. They are not required to comply. But they locked our agents in a structure, which your agents entered without consent. She opened her mouth again but shut it fast when he pulled out a citation pad. "You have 15 seconds to tell me why I shouldn't file for illegal land enforcement, trespass, and environmental disruption involving protected pollinators." She didn't answer. One of the patrolmen inside the barn let out a fresh yell, apparently having found the beehive. That was the moment Morales turned to me and said calmly, "I suggest we let them out before they do something even dumber." Sheriff Randall finally showed up not long after. Boots crunching against gravel, sunglasses already in place, sipping from a thermos that likely didn't hold just coffee. He took one look at the scene, HOA vehicles scattered across the lot, Director Kane red in the face, zoning officials muttering, and bees still buzzing angrily around the barn, and let out a single whistle. "You boys raising livestock or headlines out here?" he asked. I held up the key. "Want me to let them out?" He chuckled. "Go ahead. Just don't stand too close. I ain't got any liability forms on me." I unlocked the barn slowly, stepping back as the doors creaked open, and two very sweaty, slightly swollen HOA patrolmen stumbled out. One had hay stuck to his shirt. The other looked like he'd aged 5 years. Neither said a word as Sheriff Randall stepped forward, hands on his belt. "You boys got any idea where you are?" he asked. They opened their mouths. Then thought better of it. "Thought not," the sheriff said. "Let's get some statements before your social media careers implode completely." The sun was high now, blazing down on red faces and bruised egos, and still no sign of Grandpa. Just the faint sound of his old boat motor humming across the lake. The man had chained 2 trespassers in a barn, triggered an HOA meltdown, gone fishing, and was probably halfway through a sandwich by now. That was the moment I realized something Grandpa had once told me. You don't always have to fight fire with fire. Sometimes, you just have to lock the barn and let the bees do the talking. Grandpa didn't stroll back until the sun began its lazy dip behind the trees, casting golden light across the ranch like it had decided to stage a grand finale. He pulled up in his rattling old pickup, windows down, fishing rod still propped against the seat, and a string of trout laid neatly in the back, flapping gently in a puddle of melting ice. He stepped out like a man who had just returned from vacation, not like someone whose barn had played host to one of the most chaotic HOA episodes this county had ever seen. His hat was tilted just enough to cast a shadow over his smirking eyes, and in his hand, he carried a plastic bag of sweet tea and beef jerky, as if nothing at all unusual had happened. The yard looked like a film set. Director Kane's SUV was still parked crooked in the grass, half abandoned like its mission had combusted. 2 patrolmen sat on the hay bales outside the barn, visibly nursing stings and their own fragile pride. Sheriff Randall leaned against his cruiser, casually flipping through statements, while Zoning Officer Morales stood nearby, writing something down on an incident form. News vans had finally rolled in. One of them broadcasting live with a reporter standing near the barn, giving commentary about an unusual land rights dispute unfolding just outside of town. A camera drone hovered above us, buzzing gently like it didn't know whether to film the barn or Grandpa's trout. Grandpa stepped out, looked around slowly, then tilted his head toward me and asked, "We miss a parade?" I was too tired to laugh, but I nodded toward the patrolman and said, "They've been released on parole. Self-issued, also possibly allergic." He sniffed the air, took a sip of sweet tea, and then looked at the mess with the detached amusement of a man who had warned everyone something like this was bound to happen. "Well," he said after a pause, "hope they found what they were looking for." "They found bees, lawsuits, and a whole lot of internet backlash," I replied. "The stream's at 70,000 views now. People are calling it #Barngate. He chuckled and wandered over to Sheriff Randall, who didn't even blink at the sight of him. "You bring me one of them trout?" the sheriff asked without looking up. Grandpa handed him the string like it was a peace offering. "Caught it with that honey fly you said wouldn't work." "Wasn't a question of the fly. It was a question of the fisherman," the sheriff replied, slapping him on the back. Director Kane stood a few feet away, arms crossed, face pale, and locked in a mixture of disbelief and disbelief's angrier cousin. She was on the phone again, pacing furiously in the gravel, probably trying to figure out how many parts of her HOA had just been invalidated in the last 6 hours. Morales handed her a small packet of documents and quietly informed her that her organization was now facing 3 formal citations, including unauthorized inspection, illegal trespass, and disruption of an agricultural habitat under state conservation rules. He also added that any future attempt to access properties outside the HOA's approved zone would result in court-mandated injunctions. She tried to protest. She talked fast and loud and waved her phone as though it had the power to erase the footage currently trending across 3 social platforms. Morales didn't raise his voice. He simply pointed to the patrolman, who now looked like they'd fought a blender. "Your people crossed the line," he said. "And unfortunately for you, they filmed it. You're lucky those bees weren't part of a federal pollination project. Then we'd be talking about felony charges." One of the news reporters approached Grandpa and held out a microphone. "So, do you have a comment about what happened here today?" Grandpa squinted, wiped his hands on his pants, and leaned into the mic just enough to be heard. "Don't go where you ain't invited. Especially not in boots that track lies across honest land." The reporter blinked. "Is that a quote from something?" "Yeah," Grandpa said. "Just now." With that, he patted me on the shoulder and walked inside like the sun setting was more urgent than any chaos left outside. The screen door creaked and slammed behind him like punctuation. I stood for a moment longer, watching as Director Kane finally climbed into her vehicle and slammed the door hard enough to send a gust of paperwork swirling through the air. She didn't look at us as she peeled off down the road, leaving 2 patrolmen behind to be scooped up later like regretful litter. Sheriff Randall turned to me. "Well," he said, pocketing the trout and his copy of the incident report, "I guess next week's HOA meeting is going to be exciting." "I think they might cancel it," I replied. He gave me a slow grin. "Maybe, but not before someone paints a bee on the HOA sign." Later that evening, as the stars crept out and the land settled back into its regular quiet hum, Grandpa and I sat on the porch, eating grilled trout and watching the replay of the incident on his old tablet. He didn't laugh much, just nodded occasionally, like each unfolding disaster on screen confirmed something he already knew. At one point, I asked him, "Did you know it would go that bad?" He chewed a piece of fish, swallowed, and said, "Didn't know, didn't care. I just knew they didn't belong." Sometimes you don't need to know the whole storm. You just need to trust the fence. We watched a clip of the patrolman yelling about bees again, and this time, Grandpa let out a single chuckle. City boys ain't built for barns. They think nature's a decoration. The next morning, a hand-painted sign appeared outside the barn. It didn't say, "Keep out." It didn't threaten. It simply read, "This land doesn't tolerate trespassers. All fools, proceed at your own risk, bees included."